Jesse McGraw pulled the third grader's shirt up just an inch, and the air in the nurse's office turned to ice. Under the harsh fluorescent lights, a row of plum-colored welts circled the boy's ribs like a skeletal cage, perfectly matching the circular cigarette burns on his shoulder. The boy didn't cry. He simply stared at the wall with eyes that had seen too much for an 8-year-old, his knuckles turning white as he gripped the examination table. When Jesse reached for her medical log, a heavy shadow fell across the doorway. Principal Miller stood there, his jaw working a piece of gum with a slow, rhythmic grind, his hand resting pointedly on the doorframe as if to seal the room shut. Hours later, Jessie sat on a rotting steamer trunk in her late grandfather's attic, her flashlight cutting through a decade of dust. Her fingers pried up a loose floorboard, revealing a leather-bound diary hidden in the joists. As she cracked it open, a sprig of dried lavender crumbled into gray ash, and the first line of her grandmother's frantic script made her heart hit her ribs like a hammer. Outside, the headlights of a black patrol car flickered to life at the end of the driveway, idling in the rain, waiting. Jessie realized then that the bruises on the children weren't just accidents. They were a legacy, and the man the town called a saint had been the one holding the match. The steering wheel's leather grain bit into Jesse McGraw's palms as her old pickup truck rattled across the Blackwood town line. Outside, the West Virginia wilderness pressed in, a suffocating wall of hemlock and spruce that seemed to lean over the asphalt. The gray facade of the Blackwood school appeared through the mist, its paint peeling in long, sickly strips from decades of mountain dampness. Inside the nurse's office, the air held a stagnant weight, smelling of industrial bleach and the fine gray dust that settled over everything in this valley. Jessie ran a hand over the cold, dented metal of the medicine cabinet, her fingers betraying a rhythmic tremor she couldn't suppress. The white lab coat she'd unearthed from her trunk felt like lead across her shoulders, a uniform of a life she wasn't sure she still owned. On the desk lay the student roster. She traced the surnames: Miller, Warren, Davis. Names that hadn't crossed her mind in 10 years, but now sat like stones in her throat. The hallways outside remained unnaturally quiet, the building itself seeming to hold a collective breath, watching the prodigal daughter of the McGraw line reclaim her place within these walls. Jessie moved with practiced clinical distance until she reached little Toby, a quiet third grader with eyes too old for his face. She hooked a finger under the hem of his oversized t-shirt, lifting the fabric just enough for the harsh fluorescent light to spill across his torso. Her breath hitched. Deep, plum-colored welts circled the boy's ribs like a grotesque cage. Moving to another child nearby, she noted a perfectly circular burn on a small shoulder, the puckered skin a telltale mark of a cigarette extinguished against flesh. Toby refused to meet her gaze, his focus locked onto an anatomical skeleton poster on the far wall, his knuckles white as he gripped the edge of the examination table. When Jessie's fingertips brushed the edge of a hematoma, she felt the rigid, angry swelling beneath the skin. The boy winced, a sharp intake of air his only protest, but no cry escaped him. The wall clock's rhythmic ticking filled the silence, marking the agonizing seconds of a child's resolve to stay silent, even when the truth was written in bruises across his bones. The door to Principal Miller's office hit the wall with a dull thud as Jessie marched in, the ink on her physical exam reports still damp. Miller didn't bother looking up. His heavy jaw worked a piece of gum with bovine persistence. The moment Jessie spoke the names of the injured children, Miller's palm slammed onto the oak desk, sending a ceramic pencil cup rattling toward the edge. His face darkened to a bruised purple, his voice dropping into a guttural snarl that vibrated in his chest. He stood, closing the distance between them, until Jessie could smell the stale coffee on his breath, and thrust a thick finger toward the window. Beyond the glass, The opulent estates of the town's elite sat perched on the hillside like vultures. Miller's command was absolute. She was to forget her medical intuitions immediately if she valued her paycheck or her safety. In Blackwood, he reminded her, the pedigrees of the fathers outweighed the ethics of a school nurse every single time. Rain fell in slanted, icy needles against the black granite of the McGraw headstone, while Jesse stood at the lip of the open grave. A sea of mourners in charcoal wool and stiff veils pressed in, their heads bowed in a synchronized display of reverence for the fallen patriarch. The minister's voice wavered as he extolled William McGraw's virtues, painting him as a pillar of the community and a fierce guardian of tradition. Jesse watched the mayor dab at a stray tear while the sheriff rested a heavy, possessive hand on the mahogany casket in a final salute. The cloying scent of frankincense fought against the raw, metallic odor of wet earth. The crowd parted for Jesse as she stepped back, treating her with the wary respect afforded to royalty. Yet she saw the calculation in their eyes. They weren't offering sympathy. They were waiting for her to settle into the mold of the dutiful granddaughter, the next silent link in a chain of prestigious lies. The heavy attic door groaned on its hinges, releasing a cloud of dry rot and ancient paper that coated Jesse's tongue. Her flashlight's beam cut through the gloom, illuminating towers of cardboard boxes bound in fraying twine and furniture draped in white sheets that looked like huddling ghosts. She picked her way through the wreckage of her family's history, coughing as the disturbed dust danced in the artificial light. Her light swept over her grandfather's old fishing tackle and stacks of yellowed newspapers from the mid-'80s, their headlines shouting about coal strikes and forgotten local triumphs. Beneath her boots, the floorboards let out a long, wooden moan that echoed into the hollow guts of the house. Jessie dropped to her knees in the far corner where the shadows seemed thickest, the air turning frigid enough to prickle her skin. A draft stirred the hem of a moth-eaten curtain, and a sudden chill raced down her spine as the sheer weight of the secrets buried in this rafter's deep silence began to press against her. Her fingers caught on the jagged edge of a floorboard near the chimney flue, and the wood gave way with a sharp, dry crack. Tucked into the joist space, shielded by a thick veil of cobwebs, sat a small bundle wrapped in faded, moth-eaten flannel. Jessie unwrapped the fabric with trembling hands to find a notebook bound in scuffed leather, the initials A.M., embossed in gold that had long since flaked away. The leather felt unnaturally cold, as if it had retained the winter of the year it was hidden. She blew away a fine layer of silt, revealing fragile pages covered in Abigail's frantic, elegant script. A sprig of dried lavender fell from between the pages, crumbling into gray ash the moment it touched the air. Jessie clutched the book to her sternum, her heart hammering a frantic rhythm against her ribs, feeling as though she had just reached into a chest cavity and pulled out a still-beating heart. Jessie sank onto a nearby steamer trunk, the leather of the diary creaking as she forced it open. The early entries were marred by translucent stains where water or tears had hit the paper, blurring the ink into gray smudges. She read Abigail's accounts of the long nights when William returned home, the sentences punctuated by silent pleas for mercy that had been trapped in these pages for decades. Every word vibrated with a primal terror. Descriptions of bolted bedroom doors, the calculated application of ice to hidden bruises, and the glacial stare of a man the world called a saint. Nausea rose in Jessie's throat as the letters began to swim. She turned a page and found a clinical, detached description of her grandfather methodically breaking Abigail's fingers over a shattered dinner plate. In that moment, the polished veneer of the McGraw legacy didn't just crack. It disintegrated into a pile of jagged shards. By the middle of the diary, Jessie found a list meticulously inked onto the back flyleaf under the heading, The Shadow Brotherhood. Her fingers went numb as she read the names. Judge Warren, Dr. Harris, Sheriff Reed, and a dozen other honorable men of Blackwood. Abigail's entries described ritualized gatherings in the basement of the old mill, places where these men shed their public masks of virtue for something far darker. Jesse read about disciplinary sessions enacted upon the weak and how her grandfather had orchestrated these systematic acts of cruelty. Each name on the list felt like a death warrant. She traced the ink, realizing with a jolt of horror that the very men who had gripped her hand at the funeral, offering solemn condolences, were the same men who had spent years feeding on the misery of their own families behind closed doors. Jesse stepped into the city archives, the air inside thick with the scent of formaldehyde and aging adhesive. She kept the diary buried deep in her bag, her pulse thrumming in her ears as she approached the high wooden counter. She demanded the accident reports and police logs from 1985. Her mind racing through the dates Abigail had noted, trying to align them with the disappearances and domestic mishaps mentioned in the text. Rows of gray, acid-free boxes sat on the shelves behind the clerk, silent sentinels of Blackwood's buried truth. When she insisted on access to the restricted files, she felt the clerk's eyes narrow with a sharp, predatory suspicion. The only sound in the vaulted room was the frantic rustle of Jesse's own movements and her heavy, jagged breathing as she prepared to rip the seals off the secrets the town's elite had spent a lifetime guarding. The archive clerk, a man named Henderson, adjusted his spectacles with a slow, deliberate motion before slamming a heavy ledger shut right in front of Jesse's hands. His lips thinned into a hard line as he informed her that the requested documents were undergoing restoration and remained strictly off-limits to the public. Jesse watched his hand drift toward the telephone before she had even stepped away from the desk. Henderson didn't break eye contact as he punched in a 3-digit extension, his voice a low, vibrating murmur that carried easily through the empty lobby. "She's here," he said, the words clipping the air. "Looking for things she shouldn't be." A hot flush of adrenaline hit Jesse's neck when the clerk hung up and followed her with a cold, triumphant stare as she retreated toward the heavy glass exit doors. Jesse's sedan screamed around a blind mountain curve, the tires spitting gravel into the abyss below. In the rearview mirror, 2 blinding halos of light appeared, rapidly closing the gap. The sheriff's massive black Chevrolet surged forward, its chrome grille filling her mirror until she was blinded by the reflection. On a narrow stretch of road where the guardrail had rusted into nothingness, the SUV lunged. The impact against her rear fender sent a bone-jarring shudder through the steering column. Metal shrieked against metal, throwing sparks into the twilight. Jessie fought the wheel, her muscles screaming as she tried to keep the car from spinning into the pines 100 feet below. Through her side window, she caught a glimpse of Sheriff Reed's face, stony, impassive, and utterly determined as he nudged her vehicle closer and closer to the crumbling edge of the cliff. The sheriff stepped out of his idling SUV, leaving the red and blue lights to pulse against the wet asphalt, casting rhythmic, bruised shadows across the trees. He moved with a slow, predatory confidence, his heavy boots crunching over the glass shards scattered on the road. Leaning down toward Jesse's shattered driver's side window, he brought with him the sharp scent of wintergreen tobacco and stale peppermint. He began tapping a heavy rubber baton against his palm, the rhythmic thud, thud, thud sounding like a countdown. Behind his mirrored aviators, Jessie saw only her own terrified, distorted reflection. He bared his teeth in a humorless grin, advising her in a low, gravelly drawl to turn the car around and erase the archives from her memory forever. The silver of his badge caught the strobe of the emergency lights, flashing like a warning beacon as he dragged the baton across the crumpled metal of her door. Jessie burst into the McGraw living room, finding her mother, Helen, seated in a high-backed armchair, her hands folded with terrifying neatness in her lap. Jessie slammed Abigail's diary onto the low coffee table, sending a plume of dust into the air where it hung in the fading amber light. Her voice cracked as she pointed to the yellowed entries, forcing her mother to look at the graphic accounts of William's brutality. Helen's gaze drifted slowly from the book to her daughter, her features set into a pale, porcelain mask that revealed nothing. The grandfather clock in the corner marked the silence with a heavy, metallic tick. Jesse braced for a breakdown, for tears or an apology. But Helen's jaw only tightened, her eyes flashing with a cold, jagged light that made the air in the room feel suddenly thin and dangerous. Helen McGraw lunged from the chair, her movement so violent that a delicate teacup on the side table tumbled and shattered against the floor. Her face twisted into a mask of pure, unadulterated rage. The skin pulled tight over her cheekbones until she looked like a corpse. She clawed at the air, trying to snatch the diary from Jesse's grip, her fingernails tearing into Jesse's wrists with desperate strength. A stream of vitriol poured from her, accusations of betrayal, of being a filthy bird fouling its own nest. She screamed that the town would grind them into the dirt if this garbage ever saw the light of day. Jesse recoiled, hugging the book to her chest, while Helen paced the room like a caged animal, gasping for air and hissing that without the McGraw name, they were nothing but transients in a valley that never forgot a debt. The morning sun in the school clinic was a sickly, jaundiced yellow as a teacher led little Sarah into the room. The girl was swallowed by a moth-eaten cardigan, her small frame trembling as Jesse gently helped her peel back the layers. When the fabric fell away, Jesse's stomach did a slow, nauseating turn. Encircling the girl's thin forearms were bruises the shape of adult fingers, deep purple and yellow at the edges, as if she had been gripped in a vice. The pattern was a hauntingly exact replica of the sketches Abigail had drawn in her diary 40 years ago. Sarah remained silent, her eyes fixed on a loose thread in the floor mat, her shoulders shaking with a silent, rhythmic tremor. Jesse reached for a cotton ball soaked in alcohol, the sharp, medicinal sting of the scent filling the small room and mingling with the heavy, sour smell of a child's terror. Jesse's fingers moved with frantic speed through Sarah's school file, the edges of the paper crinkling under her touch. When she reached the line for parental guardian, the ink seemed to vibrate on the page. Thomas Warren, Jr. Jesse looked down at Abigail's open diary, where the Shadow Brotherhood list sat like a curse. At the very top was Judge Warren. The lineage of violence in Blackwood had just come into sharp, terrifying focus. The grandson was now carving the same marks into his own daughter. A heavy, rhythmic thud echoed in the hallway, the sound of a man's boots. And Jesse slammed the file shut, buried it under a stack of blank insurance forms, her heart thumping against her ribs like a bird hitting the bars of a cage. Principal Miller sat behind his mahogany desk, the light of his lamp carving deep, cavernous shadows into his face. He didn't offer Jesse a chair. Instead, he slid a formal document across the blotter, the school's seal looking like a bloody thumbprint at the bottom. His voice was a dry, airless rasp as he read the notice of disciplinary action, citing unauthorized medical interference. He forbade Jesse from touching any student without a witness present, labeling her exams as morbid curiosity. When Jesse opened her mouth to protest, Miller leaned forward, the wood of the desk groaning under his massive weight. He stared at her with watery, unblinking eyes that held a clear, lethal promise. One more question, and she would be stripped of her license and cast out of the town before the sun set. The mountain shadows had already swallowed the McGraw porch by the time Jesse pulled into the drive. She reached for the front door handle, but it met her with a hollow, unyielding thunk. She hammered on the glass, calling for her mother, but the house remained a dark, silent monolith. There, on the rain-slicked concrete of the top step, sat her old leather suitcase. The zipper had burst, and the sleeve of her favorite wool sweater poked out like a tongue. Taped to the handle was a scrap of paper with Helen's sharp, panicked handwriting. "Come back when you learn to respect this family." A gust of wind cut through Jessie's thin jacket, and she stood on the threshold of her own home, realizing she was now a refugee in the only place she had left to go. Jessie was sitting on the floor of a cheap motel room when the night exploded in a rain of glass. A heavy brick tore through the window, showering the carpet in 1,000 shimmering diamonds. She screamed, shielding her eyes, as a bundle wrapped in rusted barbed wire skittered across the floor toward her. The wire bit into the gray butcher paper, leaving rusty, metallic stains. With shaking hands, Jessie unwrapped the message, the barbs slicing her fingertips. Inside was a tattered obituary of her grandfather, with a message scrawled in thick, red marker. "Give up the book, or the next hole will be in your head." Outside, the roar of an engine accelerated into the distance, leaving the smell of burnt rubber to drift through the jagged hole in the wall. Jessie's thumb jammed repeatedly against her phone screen, trying to trigger the upload of the diary photos to the cloud. The progress bar sat at a defiant 0%, and a small slashed icon appeared in the corner of the display. No service. She lunged for her laptop, but the Wi-Fi symbol pulsed a dull, mocking gray. She ran out onto the motel balcony, thrusting her phone toward the dark mountain peaks, hoping for a single bar of signal. But the sky over Blackwood felt like a leaden dome. The entire block was submerged in an unnatural, heavy silence. Even the streetlights had dimmed to a sickly orange glow. She realized with a cold, sinking dread that the town's infrastructure had been weaponized. They had cut her off, turning the motel into a digital tomb. Jessie let herself back into the McGraw kitchen using the spare key hidden in the mudroom, only to find Helen waiting. Her mother stood by the butcher block island, her hand white-knuckled around the hilt of a long carving knife. The light from the stove hood caught the edge of the blade, casting a thin, lethal line of silver across the room. Helen didn't move, her eyes fixed on the bag where the diary was hidden. She spoke in a flat, hypnotic monotone about the greater good, and how some wounds were too deep to be lanced without the whole town bleeding out. She stepped forward, blocking the path to the hallway, the tip of the knife trembling as it pointed toward Jessie's heart, while the wind outside began to howl, snapping pine branches against the siding. The front door of the McGraw house buckled under a massive blow, and the sheriff surged into the foyer with 2 deputies at his heels. They didn't produce a warrant. Their faces remained obscured by the low brims of their hats. Reed lunged forward and snatched the bag from Jessie's shoulder, upending it onto the rug. Medical journals, her stethoscope, and the private notes on the children's injuries tumbled across the floor. One deputy began methodically flipping through the pages, marking lines with a heavy pen, while the other stepped on her phone endoscope, the plastic snapping with a sharp, final sound. The sheriff swept the documents into a heavy plastic evidence bag, declaring them confiscated for investigation into slander. Jessie lunged for the bathroom, throwing the bolt just as a heavy shoulder slammed into the other side of the door. She pressed her spine against the cold subway tile, feeling the vibrations of the sheriff's boots through the floor. The wooden panel groaned, a hairline fracture snaking down its center. Reed was snarling on the other side, each impact making the hinges scream in protest. Jessie clutched Abigail's diary to her ribs, the leather binding biting into her skin through her shirt. The small room filled with the scent of lavender soap and the metallic tang of fear. She watched as the white paint on the doorframe began to flake off in long, jagged strips, the wood underneath splintering as the barrier between her and the men outside began to fail. A sudden, deafening crack of thunder shook the house to its foundation, and a blinding blue-white arc of lightning slammed into the transformer box behind the garage. The hum of the refrigerator died instantly, and Blackwood was plunged into a thick, suffocating darkness. The single bulb above the vanity flared orange and then shattered, dusting the floor in glass. In the sudden vacuum of sound, Jesse could hear the sheriff's ragged, frustrated breathing on the other side of the door and the frantic drumming of rain against the roof. She stood frozen, her eyes straining against a blackness so dense it felt physical, waiting for the next flash of light to reveal if the door was still holding. Jesse fumbled for the latch on the narrow window above the toilet, shoving the frame outward with all her strength. The mountain air, thick with the smell of wet pine and ozone, slapped her face as she swung a leg over the sill. She found herself on a narrow stone ledge, her chest pressed against the rain-slicked stucco of the house. The downpour was a solid wall, turning her clothes into a heavy, freezing weight in seconds. Water blinded her, but she moved her feet inch by inch along the treacherous projection, refusing to look down at the jagged foundation stones hidden in the dark. Her fingers were numb, but she gripped the diary beneath her coat as the final, splintering crash echoed from inside the bathroom. The ground beneath the McGraw estate began to hum with a low, visceral roar. From the hillside above, a torrent of mud, uprooted stumps, and boulders tore loose, surging toward the main driveway. With a sound like grinding teeth, the mass of wet earth hit the asphalt, swallowing the gate and burying the only road out under 10 feet of debris. Jesse watched from her precarious perch as the mud flow engulfed the sheriff's cruiser, the red and blue lights disappearing beneath a wave of brown sludge. The house was now an island, trapped between a crumbling cliff and an impassable grave of earth. The sound of snapping timber drowned out everything else, and Jesse realized that the trap had finally snapped shut on everyone inside. Jesse dropped from the ledge onto the kitchen terrace and slipped through the back door, hoping to reach the cellar. In the shadows of the kitchen, illuminated only by the rhythmic strobe of lightning, stood Helen. Her mother hadn't moved from the island, the carving knife in her hand, catching every flash of light until it looked like a sliver of white fire. Helen seemed taller, thinner in the gray light, her hair a wild halo and her eyes 2 hollow pits of shadow. She didn't speak, but the tip of the blade rose slowly, tracking Jesse's movement. The smell of wet wool and ozone filled the kitchen as mother and daughter faced each other in a silence more violent than the storm outside. Helen lunged. Her fingers, as hard and gnarled as old roots, tangled into Jesse's hair. A sharp yank sent Jesse's head snapping back, and she hit the linoleum hard, her knees barking against the floor. Helen pinned her down, her breath, bitter with the smell of oversteeped coffee, burning Jesse's face. The mother clawed at the bag, trying to rip Abigail's diary away, her nails leaving long, angry furrows across Jesse's forearms. Outside, the wind hammered the shutters until the whole house groaned, while inside, the 2 women rolled across the floor in a desperate, primal struggle. The leather binding of the book grew slick, but Jesse held on with the strength of the damned. In the chaos of the struggle, Jesse's elbow caught the edge of a low mahogany table. A delicate porcelain vase, a McGraw heirloom, tipped and shattered into 1,000 razor-sharp petals. Jesse's palm came down hard on a cluster of shards, and a hot, pulsing pain lanced up her arm. Blood, dark and thick in the gloom, immediately coated her fingers and began to drip onto the yellowed pages of Abigail's diary. The crimson stains spread across the paper, obscuring the old ink and soaking into the porous leather. Jesse felt her hand go numb, the book becoming nearly impossible to hold as it grew wet and slippery. The smell of iron rose to meet the scent of old paper, while the blood continued to claim the dead woman's words. Helen regained her footing and shoved Jesse back against the stone fireplace. The cold steel of the carving knife pressed into the soft skin just beneath Jesse's jawline, forcing her to go still. Helen's breathing was heavy and ragged, her face inches away, a manic light dancing in her pupils. She hissed a demand for the book, claiming the McGraw honor had been built over decades and wouldn't be toppled by a delusional girl. The blade pressed harder, and Jesse felt a thin, hot line of pain. In that moment, Helen looked like a high priestess of a dead religion, ready to slaughter her own flesh to keep the ghosts of the past from escaping their graves. Jesse, feeling the blood from her hand soak into her sleeve, forced the diary open to the middle. She began to read aloud, her voice trembling at first, but then gaining a hard, rhythmic strength that rose above the wind. She shouted the dates and the names, her voice echoing Abigail's clinical descriptions of the nights spent in the cellar. A roar of thunder shook the rafters, but Jesse didn't stop, hurling the words of betrayal and systematic pain into her mother's twisted face. Each sentence landed like a physical blow, shattering the silence that had protected the McGraw name for 50 years. She saw the knife in Helen's hand begin to waver, the tip tracing small, frantic circles in the air. Jesse turned to the pages where Abigail had documented the molding of young Helen. Her voice grew cold as she read the lines about her grandfather locking a 5-year-old Helen in the coal cellar for making too much noise. She read about the systematic breaking of a child's will, how Helen had been taught to smile while her ribs were bruised, and how she had been turned into a living porcelain doll to maintain the town's illusion. Jesse described the entry where William had forced Helen to burn her own dolls to prove her loyalty. In the dim light, these words seemed to take shape, pulling the ghosts of old traumas out of the corners of the room. The hand holding the knife began to shake with a violent, uncontrollable tremor. The blade drifted away from Jesse's throat, its path erratic and broken. Helen's face began to dissolve. The mask of rage crumbled, revealing a hollow, primal terror beneath. In her wide, staring eyes, she wasn't seeing her daughter anymore. She was seeing the damp, black walls of the cellar from her childhood. She looked like she was drowning in the air she was breathing. The knife hit the hardwood floor with a sharp, metallic ring. Helen gasped, her shoulders hitching as the layers of lies she had lived by began to slough off her mind like dead skin. Helen collapsed onto the floor, her knees hitting the jagged shards of the vase. But she didn't seem to feel the glass. She buried her face in her hands, her body racked by a sound that started as a whimper and ended as a shattered, hollow moan. Helen clutched the blood-stained pages of the diary, her crimson fingerprints overlapping Abigail's fragile script. She held the paper inches from her eyes, her lips moving without sound as she read the account of that frozen winter evening when William's heavy belt had whistled through the air in this very room. A jagged, guttural sound tore from Helen's throat, escalating into a scream that made the window panes vibrate in their frames. It wasn't a cry of grief. It was a violent, visceral confession ripped from her lungs. Jesse's blood mingled with the ink of the past as Helen's nails bit into the parchment. Finally acknowledging the truth of the man whose portrait still watched them from the mantel, Jessie sank to her knees in front of her mother, the porcelain shards crunching beneath her denim like breaking bone. She reached for a white linen cloth on the side table and tore it into long, jagged strips. With steady hands, she began to wrap Helen's palms, shielding the deep cuts earned from the shattered vase. Helen shuddered, her forehead dropping onto Jessie's shoulder, her tears leaving hot, salty tracks on the bloodied cotton. Jessie pulled the knot tight at her mother's wrist, feeling the icy wall of denial finally give way. The woman who had been a heartless sentry for the family's secrets was gone, replaced by someone broken, bleeding, and finally, undeniably free. The front door frame gave way with a final, splintering groan as the sheriff and his deputies barged into the living room, their flashlight beams cutting through the dark. The light skittered over the bloodstains and the torn linen, but Reed stopped dead when Helen stood up. She didn't look like a victim. She gripped the carving knife by its hilt, the steel gleaming in the flashlight beams as she leveled it at the sheriff's throat. Helen stepped in front of Jesse, her shadow stretching across the wall like a predatory bird. The deputies hesitated, their hands hovering over their holsters, seeing the lethal clarity in Helen's eyes. The era of bowing to the men of Blackwood had ended in the silence of that room. Helen's voice was a blade of ice, cutting through the humidity of the storm. She ordered the sheriff to leave her property immediately, the knife in her hand tracing a short, lethal arc. She bared her teeth as she informed him that Jesse wasn't the only one who knew the truth. Copies of Abigail's diary were already tucked into the mailboxes of the town's women, hidden in crawl spaces and sewn into the linings of coats. Reed went rigid, a sheen of sweat breaking out on his forehead. Helen promised to turn Blackwood into a funeral pyre if a single deputy took another step toward her daughter. The threat of total exposure hung in the air like a poisonous fog, forcing the sheriff to slowly pull his hand away from his belt. While Helen held the men in a stalemate, Jesse slipped toward the kitchen window. She cracked the sash, letting the wet mountain air rush in. In the thick lilac bushes outside, Sarah's pale, terrified face appeared. Jesse reached out, thrusting the original diary, now sealed in a waterproof plastic sleeve, into the girl's small, trembling hands. Sarah's fingers locked onto the bundle, and she vanished into the rainy darkness of the garden, a ghost moving through the trees. Jesse slammed the window shut and turned back to the men in the living room, a strange, calm heat spreading through her chest. The evidence was gone, carried away by the very future they had tried to break. The sheriff took a step back, the crunch of glass under his boots sounding like a death knell. He looked at Helen's unyielding stance, then at Jesse's empty hands, and realized the leverage had evaporated. Outside, the roar of the mudslide continued to isolate them. But inside, the rebellion was already complete. Reed spat on the rug, a final, petty act of defiance, before signaling his men to retreat. He knew that a frontal assault on the town's most prominent widow during a natural disaster would be the spark that burned his career to the ground. The police backed out of the house, their hats pulled low, while Helen kept the knife leveled at their hearts until the door finally swung shut. The dawn sun finally cracked through the gray overcast, illuminating a landscape of mud and shattered timber. Jesse and Helen, their jackets caked in mountain clay, moved to the edge of the blocked drive and began throwing stones aside to clear a path. From the morning mist, figures began to materialize. The local postwoman, a primary school teacher, and Toby's mother. The women of Blackwood arrived in work boots and heavy gloves, taking their places in a silent line beside Jesse. They didn't carry signs, but their linked arms formed a human wall against the sheriff's cruiser as it tried to nudge forward. Reed watched from behind his windshield, his jaw set, as the living barrier of the town's mothers and daughters refused to budge. The sharp scent of coffee and antiseptic filled the school clinic as Jesse moved extra chairs into a circle. The mothers of the injured children sat shoulder to shoulder, their faces pale but their gazes unwavering. Jesse opened a copy of Abigail's diary and began to read. The names of the abusers and the accounts of decades of hidden agony fell into the room like lead weights. One woman covered her mouth to stifle a sob. Another gripped the edge of the table until her knuckles turned white. The meeting was a silent tribunal, with Jesse presenting medical charts that mirrored the historical atrocities. The diary had become the catalyst for a quiet revolution, a realization that their collective fear was the only thing keeping the Shadow Brotherhood alive. On the steps of the town hall, Helen McGraw methodically tore the deed to the McGraw estate into small, jagged pieces. The mountain wind caught the fragments, swirling them toward the forest. She announced to the gathered townspeople that the house once a fortress of silence, would now serve as a sanctuary for the displaced and the abused. She handed the keys to Jesse, a gesture that signaled the final death of William McGraw's legacy. On the facade of the mansion, workers were already prying the brass nameplate from the brickwork. Helen stood tall, her bandaged hands resting on the iron railing, the shadow of the woman who once hid her bruises finally cast aside for good. Thomas Warren Jr. slammed through the school's glass doors, his face a mask of purple rage, his tie dangling loose. He bellowed Sarah's name, demanding his daughter. But he was met by a solid phalanx of nurses and teachers led by Jesse. She didn't flinch. She held up a folder filled with high-resolution photos of the finger-shaped bruises on Sarah's arms. When Warren raised a hand to strike, Jesse's voice, flat and metallic, began reciting the specific statutes of the penal code he had violated. Behind her, the other women held up their phones, recording every snarl and every twitch. Warren froze, seeing Sarah clutching Helen's hand in the background, and realized his era of dominion had reached its jagged end. In the center of the Blackwood square, a bonfire roared, its orange light licking at the cooling evening air. Jesse approached the flames, clutching the original leather-bound diary of Abigail McGraw. She held the book high, ensuring every woman in the circle saw the stained, yellowed pages that had started it all. With a slow, deliberate motion, Jesse dropped the book into the heart of the embers. The leather curled and blackened, releasing a thick plume of smoke that smelled of lavender and old, forgotten winters. Jesse watched the pages turn to ash, knowing that the truth no longer needed a book to survive. It was now etched into the memory of every woman standing in the light.